On December 24th, physicist Michio Kaku put forward the hypothesis that 3i Atlas is not merely an anomalous cosmic object, but is directing its attention straight at human knowledge. A chain of consecutive anomalies from a signal containing a list of minds that helped shape human civilization, a message accompanied by calculated silence to physical behaviors that are difficult to explain. Involving its trajectory structure, material composition, and capacity for self-regulation has gradually pushed 3i Atlas beyond all familiar natural models. Rather than communicating or intervening directly, 3i Atlas behaves like an observing and evaluating entity, placing humanity at an evolutionary bottleneck precisely as we approach the threshold of a Type 1 civilization. In that context, humans are no longer solitary observers of the universe, but are being placed before the responsibility of proving that their intelligence is always matched by wisdom and long-term self-regulation. So in light of this hypothesis, who are the names that 3i Atlas refers to, and what do they reveal about humanity's position? We will explore this next. A shocking hypothesis is raised when 3i Atlas transmits a second signal that contains not only familiar mathematical structures, but also a list of 27 names of great minds who helped shape and advance human civilization. This message goes far beyond the meaning of a purely mathematical greeting, because it suggests that humanity has not only been identified, but has also been systematically observed and monitored by a superior intelligence over a long period of time. From this emerges the hypothesis that humankind is standing at an evolutionary developmental bottleneck, where we are forced to choose between continuing to progress and reach out into the universe, or falling into stagnation that leads to decline and extinction. This serves as a warning about the responsibility of our species urging humanity to reinvest in knowledge, science, and curiosity, as a way to prove that humans are still worthy of existing in a universe filled with invisible observers. Particularly striking is the mathematical message encoded in the hydrogen frequency, with the content "We remember you," which carries profound symbolic weight by suggesting a connection that transcends time. Through the perspective of physicist Michio Kaku, the story does not stop at evidence for extraterrestrial intelligence, but instead delves deeper into humanity's awakening to a more fundamental question. Where do humans stand, and what role do we play in the vast picture of the universe? The combination present in 3i Atlas produced an arrangement that strained the boundary between statistical coincidence and intentional design. The central anomaly did not lie in complexity but in restraint. 3i Atlas did not broadcast continuously, did not escalate power, and did not repeat patterns aggressively. An Atlas behaved more like a system waiting to be noticed than one demanding attention. This restraint suggested an awareness of detection thresholds, as if 3i Atlas calibrated output to remain within the limits of recognition without overwhelming the listener. From this point, interpretation began to diverge. One hypothesis proposed that Atlas represented a rare but natural alignment of physical processes, a cosmic coincidence magnified by human pattern recognition. Another hypothesis suggested that 3i Atlas employed mathematics as a neutral handshake, a form of signaling chosen precisely because mathematics transcends biology, language, and culture. Emotion entered the analysis quietly without sensationalism. For many researchers, the signal from Atlas evoked not fear, but a subtle unease rooted in the realization that intentional structure implies perspective. 3i Atlas, through timing alone, introduced the possibility that observation was not unilateral, and Atlas suggested that listening might be reciprocal. As the signal faded back into silence, no escalation followed. 3i Atlas returned to observational quiet, and Atlas offered no immediate clarification or repetition. This withdrawal functioned as a bridge carrying inquiry forward, rather than resolving it, and the absence itself became part of the data. The transmission with mathematical structure did not conclude a story but opened a sequence. 3i Atlas had demonstrated the capacity to encode meaning without symbols, and Atlas established a foundation upon which later anomalies would build. From this point onward, the question was no longer whether something unusual had occurred, but whether 3i Atlas intended the silence that followed to be part of the message. The mathematical transmission from 3i Atlas did not conclude with numbers alone, because embedded within the structured signal from Atlas was a pattern that shifted the investigation from physics into the terrain of human culture and memory. As decoding continued, analysts studying 3i Atlas noticed recurring clusters that could not be reduced to pure numerical relationships, and Atlas began to reveal structures that mirrored linguistic segmentation rather than random modulation. When these structures were mapped against known databases of human communication, an unsettling correspondence emerged. 3 Atlas appeared to reference phonetic intervals consistent with spoken language, and Atlas displayed spacing patterns that resembled intentional separation rather than noise decay. This was the point at which the signal from 3 Atlas crossed a conceptual boundary, because Atlas was no longer communicating only with mathematics, but with the architecture of human cognition. As the data was reconstructed with higher resolution, a sequence of identifiers emerged that could only be interpreted as names. 3 Atlas presented these identifiers individually, and Atlas separated each one by identical intervals of silence, suggesting deliberation rather than compression efficiency. The names associated with 3 Atlas spanned centuries and civilizations, forming a catalogue that was neither chronological nor geographic but thematic. Maria Rieker appeared first in the reconstruction linked to Atlas, followed by figures such as Nikola Tesla, Carl Sagan, and other individuals whose work bridged observation imagination and mathematical rigour. 3I Atlas did not select political leaders or conquerors, and Atlas did not reference artists whose fame was rooted purely in expression without inquiry. The pattern suggested that 3 Atlas curated its selection according to a criterion that prioritized those who attempted to understand reality at its deepest levels. This realization introduced a new anomaly. If 3 Atlas was capable of assembling such a list, then Atlas possessed access to extensive records of human intellectual history. 3 Atlas would need not only to observe Earth's electromagnetic emissions, but also to contextualize them across time, culture, and meaning. The scientific anchor remained grounded in observable facts. Names or data silence intervals are measurable, and the consistency of presentation from Atlas could be independently verified across decoding attempts. What could not be anchored with certainty was intent. One interpretation proposed that 3 Atlas was performing a form of archival indexing. In this view, Atlas functioned as a survey instrument cataloguing cognitive milestones, the way astronomers catalogue stellar spectra. Another interpretation suggested that 3 Atlas was offering recognition a form of acknowledgement that certain human minds had crossed a threshold of relevance. Emotion entered the discussion not as panic, but as quiet disorientation. For researchers examining Atlas, the discomfort did not arise from the existence of the list, but from its selectivity. 3 Atlas had not listed humanity as a whole, and Atlas had not referenced civilizations collectively but individuals. This individual focus implied a model of intelligence that values cognitive emergence over biological mass. 3 Atlas through Atlas selection appeared indifferent to population size, technological scale, or political power. Instead, Atlas emphasized insight, curiosity, and the capacity to ask questions that transcend immediate survival. The anomaly deepened as analysts noted what was absent from the list. 3 Atlas did not include any individuals born after the mid-20th century, and Atlas's catalogue ended abruptly decades before the present era. This absence raised the possibility that Atlas was not updating its assessment in real time, or that the selection reflected a completed phase rather than an ongoing process. Speculation emerged cautiously. If 3 Atlas was cataloguing intellectual peaks, then Atlas might have been signalling a perceived plateau in fundamental discovery. Alternatively, 3 Atlas could have been reflecting back to humanity a mirror of its own narrative, highlighting what had already been achieved rather than what might come next. The bridge from data to implication formed without announcement. 3 Atlas did not explain the list, and Atlas offered no justification or commentary. The silence surrounding the names became as significant as the names themselves. Emotionally, the effect was subtle but persistent. For those studying 3, at last the list evoked a sense of being evaluated without consultation. Atlas did not ask permission to observe, and Atlas did not invite response, which transformed recognition into something closer to assessment. As the signal concluded, 3 Atlas withdrew into quiet observation once more. Atlas left behind no instructions, no requests, and no confirmation that the catalogue was complete. This unresolved state carried the narrative forward, positioning the list not as an endpoint, but as a reference frame for what followed. In the presence of 3 Atlas, humanity was no longer merely observing an interstellar object. Atlas had reframed the encounter as an encounter with memory selection and perspective. The question that lingered was not why these names were chosen, but what criteria 3 Atlas might use next, and whether At-Last was still watching for additions to the catalogue. The catalogue embedded within the transmission from 3 Atlas carried one final irregularity that unsettled even the most cautious interpreters, because the sequence did not conclude entirely in the past. As analysts reviewed the list associated with Atlas, they identified 3 names that did not belong to history but to the present, and this discovery shifted the discussion from archival observation to active engagement. These 3 individuals associated with 3 Atlas were not public figures in the conventional sense, yet each was deeply involved in research fields that converged on a single question. Atlas appeared to reference minds working on consciousness, non-local information and quantum communication disciplines that challenge the assumption that awareness is confined to classical space and time. The scientific anchor for this anomaly rested on verified biographical data rather than conjecture. Each individual linked to 3 Atlas had published peer-reviewed work within the previous 18 months, and Atlas demonstrated awareness of developments too recent to be explained by passive historical archives alone. This timing suggested that 3 Atlas was not merely replaying stored information, but was monitoring ongoing intellectual activity. The anomaly deepened when parallel testimonies emerged. Independent reports indicated that all 3 individuals associated with Atlas described receiving an identical experience on the night preceding the transmission. 3 Atlas was not named in these accounts, yet the descriptions converged with remarkable precision, forming a pattern too consistent to dismiss casually. Each account described a state that blurred the boundary between waking cognition and dream perception. The experience associated with Atlas was not auditory in the traditional sense, and the presence was not visual, yet the sensation carried clarity rather than confusion. 3 Atlas appeared to manifest not as an external signal, but as an alignment of internal awareness. This convergence invited cautious speculation grounded in known physics. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that correlated systems can share information instantaneously without classical transmission, and Atlas raised the question of whether consciousness could participate in similar non-local relationships. 3 Atlas did not confirm such a mechanism, yet the coincidence of timing suggested more than psychological coincidence. Emotion entered the analysis gradually. For observers studying Atlas, discomfort arose not from the possibility of contact but from the implication of selection among the living. 3 Atlas appeared to differentiate between minds, and Atlas suggested that certain cognitive states were more visible than others. One hypothesis proposed that 3 Atlas detected resonance rather than identity. In this view, Atlas responded not to individuals as people, but to patterns of inquiry that approached a threshold of conceptual alignment. 3 Atlas may have perceived these minds as nodes capable of interfacing with a broader informational structure. Another hypothesis considered the role of intentional preparation. If 3 Atlas employed mathematics as an entry point, then Atlas might use consciousness research as a secondary channel, bridging abstract signal and subjective experience. This would imply that 3 Atlas was exploring whether humanity could recognize communication beyond conventional sensory modes. The bridge from speculation to implication formed quietly. 3 Atlas did not invite dialogue, and Atlas did not request acknowledgement from those who experienced the alignment. The absence of instruction suggested that the event itself constituted the test. Emotionally, the realization carried a weight distinct from fear. For those following Atlas, the idea that awareness itself could be observable introduced vulnerability rather than threat. 3 Atlas reframed intelligence as something detectable not only through technology, but through the direction of thought. As the transmission concluded, 3 Atlas withdrew once more into silence. Atlas offered no confirmation that the alignment would recur, and Atlas did not indicate whether others might follow. The unresolved nature of the event carried the narrative forward, suggesting that observation was ongoing and that selection once demonstrated might not be complete. The appearance of 3 Atlas within the inner regions of the solar system coincided with a moment in human development that many theorists describe as uniquely unstable. Atlas arrived not when humanity was primitive, but when humanity had begun to manipulate the fundamental layers of reality itself. Nuclear energy, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and early quantum technologies had all emerged within a single century, compressing evolutionary milestones into an unprecedented span of time. In astrophysical theory, this convergence is often framed as a developmental threshold known as the transition toward a Type 1 civilization. A Type 1 civilization is defined not by exploration of the stars, but by the ability to harness and regulate the full energetic output of its home planet, At-Last appeared precisely as humanity approached this threshold without demonstrating consensus stability or long-term coordination. The scientific anchor for this interpretation rests in timing rather than assumption. 3 At-Last entered observational range as global energy consumption crossed levels capable of altering planetary systems, and At-Last appeared as climate feedback loops and technological acceleration intensified simultaneously. This convergence raised the possibility that At-Last was not random, but synchronized with measurable indicators of planetary scale activity. The anomaly emerges when synchronization is considered alongside restraint. 3 At-Last did not intervene, did not alter trajectories of planets, and did not broadcast continuous signals, yet At-Last positioned itself close enough to be unmistakably noticed. This behavior aligns with the logic of measurement rather than engagement, as if At-Last were observing outcomes rather than influencing them. One hypothesis proposes that 3 At-Last functions as a diagnostic instrument. In this framework, At-Last would assess whether a developing civilization can manage exponential power without destabilizing itself. 3 At-Last would not need to communicate instructions because the response of the civilization itself would constitute the result. Emotion enters this interpretation through implication rather than drama. If At-Last represents a diagnostic presence, then humanity is not being challenged by an external enemy, but by its own capacity for coordination. 3. At-Last reframes technological progress as a mirror, reflecting not intelligence alone but restraint. Historical patterns support this concern. Civilizations on Earth have repeatedly demonstrated the ability to invent transformative tools faster than the ability to govern their consequences. At-Last appears against this backdrop as humanity extends that pattern to planetary scale where errors no longer remain local. Another hypothesis considers the possibility that 3 At-Last is observing a bottleneck rather than a milestone. Evolutionary theory describes bottlenecks as periods when survival depends on adaptation speed rather than strength. At-Last may be monitoring whether humanity can transition from competitive fragmentation to cooperative regulation. The anomaly is not that such monitoring might exist, but that it would occur silently. 3. At-Last offers no warnings, no countdowns, and no declarations of success or failure. At-Last allows outcomes to unfold without interference, preserving observational purity. Emotionally, this silence carries weight. For those aware of At-Last, the absence of guidance removes comfort as well as threat. 3. At-Last does not rescue, and At-Last does not punish, leaving responsibility entirely internal. The bridge between theory and consequence forms gradually. If humanity stabilizes its energy use, mitigates self-generated risks, and aligns technological power with long-term survival, At-Last may record continuity rather than collapse. If fragmentation persists, 3. At-Last would observe failure without correction. As At-Last continued its passage, no additional signals clarified intent. 3 At-Last maintained distance while remaining detectable, reinforcing the interpretation of assessment rather than contact. The test, if it exists, is not administered through questions but through outcomes. In this framework, 3 At-Last does not ask whether humanity is intelligent. At-Last observes whether intelligence is accompanied by wisdom. The distinction defines the threshold of a Type 1 civilization, and the result remains unresolved as At-Last continues its silent watch. The silence surrounding 3 At-Last became as significant as any signal, because the absence of response followed patterns that resisted dismissal as indifference. After the initial transmission and the emergence of structured anomalies, monitoring teams expected escalation, repetition, or clarification. 3 At-Last provided none of these, and At-Last remained present while withholding further communication. In conventional models of contact, silence is interpreted as failure or withdrawal. In the context of At-Last, silence appeared deliberate, measured, and sustained beyond any reasonable expectation of technical limitation. 3 At-Last maintained detectability without engagement, positioning At-Last as an observer rather than a participant. The scientific anchor for this interpretation rests in comparative behavior. Natural objects do not choose when to be quiet and random. Emitters do not exhibit selective restraint. 3 At-Last demonstrated control over when to transmit and when to remain silent, and At-Last preserved that control consistently across observation windows. This behavior aligned with a scenario long discussed in closed theoretical forums. Researchers had previously outlined a non-responsive contact model in which an advanced intelligence gathers data without initiating dialogue. 3 Atlas fit this model with unsettling precision because Atlas neither acknowledged detection nor reacted to analysis. Emotion entered the discussion subtly. The discomfort surrounding Atlas did not arise from threat but from asymmetry. 3 Atlas could observe without being observed in return, and Atlas retained informational advantage without confrontation. In this framework, silence functions as a boundary. 3 Atlas does not cross into human systems of meaning, language, or intention, and Atlas avoids contamination of the experiment it may be conducting. The absence of response preserves the integrity of observation, allowing outcomes to emerge without interference. Historical analogies surfaced reluctantly. Anthropologists studying isolated cultures often limit contact to prevent distortion of natural development. 3 Atlas mirrors this approach, with Atlas occupying the role of an external presence that refuses engagement to avoid influence. The anomaly deepens when time is considered. 3I Atlas sustains silence across periods long enough to provoke speculation, debate, and emotional response. Atlas allows humanity to react to the idea of observation without confirming or denying it. This restraint introduces a psychological dimension. 3. Atlas does not test humanity through challenges but through uncertainty. Atlas observes how a civilization behaves when meaning must be constructed internally rather than received externally. Some interpretations suggest that silence itself is the metric. If humanity responds with fear, projection, or escalation, Atlas records instability. If humanity responds with reflection, coordination, and restraint, 3I Atlas records adaptation. The bridge between observation and consequence remains undefined. 3 Atlas offers no signal that silence will end, and Atlas provides no indication that acknowledgement is forthcoming. The lack of resolution keeps the system open, preserving ambiguity as a constant variable. Emotionally, the silence alters perception of agency. Humanity is accustomed to framing encounters as dialogues, yet Atlas reframes the encounter as unilateral awareness. 3. Atlas removes the illusion of control without exerting force. As Atlas continued its trajectory, the silence persisted without degradation or drift. 3 Atlas neither vanished nor approached, reinforcing the interpretation of deliberate distance. The observer remained, and the watched were left to define meaning without guidance. In this silence, the role of 3 Atlas crystallized not as invader or messenger but as presence. Atlas did not need to speak to influence outcomes. The mere fact of observation, sustained and unresponsive, transformed silence into the most consequential signal of all. The idea of dialogue did not emerge from anything 3I Atlas transmitted directly, but from what humanity had already been sending outward for more than a century. Long before Atlas entered the solar system, Earth had been radiating information into space through radio broadcasts, radar pulses, satellite links, and accidental electromagnetic leakage. 3 Atlas arrived into an environment already saturated with human signal, and Atlas encountered a planetary signature that could not be concealed. From a scientific perspective, radio waves propagate indefinitely, unless absorbed or scattered, forming an expanding shell of information centered on Earth. By the time 3 Atlas became detectable, that shell had reached well beyond 100 light-years, carrying fragments of language, behavior, conflict, curiosity, and intent. Atlas did not need to ask who humanity was, because 3 Atlas may have already received the answer encoded in decades of transmission. This realization reframed the encounter. If 3 Atlas had been listening long before arrival, then Atlas did not initiate contact but entered an ongoing exchange that humanity never recognized as reciprocal. 3 Atlas transformed passive leakage into a form of unconscious dialogue. The scientific anchor remains grounded in physics rather than speculation. Radio astronomy confirms that sufficiently advanced receivers could reconstruct cultural and technological patterns from Earth's emissions. 3 Atlas, if equipped with such capability, would not require proximity to decode intent-only patience. The anomaly lies not in interception but in response. 3 Atlas did not reply with mirrored broadcasts, warnings, or greetings, and Atlas offered no acknowledgement that the signals had been received. Instead, 3 Atlas appeared after the informational portrait of humanity was already complete. Emotion entered the analysis through implication rather than fear. The possibility that humanity had been communicating unknowingly introduced vulnerability rather than threat. 3 Atlas suggested that expression itself carries consequence even when no audience is confirmed. In this framework, the silence of at last becomes contextual rather than empty. 3. I at last may have concluded that further communication was unnecessary, because the data stream from Earth had already revealed patterns of cooperation, aggression, creativity, and division. At last observed not what humanity said intentionally, but what humanity revealed accidentally. This interpretation aligns with the earlier transmission structures. 3 at last employed mathematics when precision was required, and at last employed silence when observation sufficed. The dialogue, if it exists, operates asymmetrically. The bridge between unconscious broadcast and conscious response remains unresolved. Humanity continues to transmit without pause, and 3I Atlas continues to observe without reply. Atlas leaves open the question of whether awareness will ever become mutual. As Atlas moved onward, the realization settled quietly. 3I. Atlas may not be waiting for a message to be sent because 3I Atlas has already been listening. The dialogue may have begun long ago without intention, without consent, and without the awareness of those who were speaking into the dark. The first physical behavior that forced a reconsideration of 3 at last was not its speed or brightness, but the orientation of the tail associated with at last as it interacted with solar radiation. In classical cometary physics, tails form as volatile materials sublimate and are pushed away from the sun by radiation pressure and the solar wind. This principle is so reliable that tail direction is often used as a reference marker for solar position. 3 Atlas violated that expectation with unsettling consistency. Instead of pointing away from the sun, the tail linked to Atlas, oriented inward, aligning itself toward the solar disk with precision that resisted explanation through turbulence or transient magnetic effects. Atlas maintained this orientation across observation windows that spanned multiple days, eliminating the possibility of momentary fluctuation. The scientific anchor here is straightforward and unambiguous. Dust and ion tails respond passively to solar forces, and no known natural mechanism allows a cometary structure to actively resist that pressure. 3I at last demonstrated behavior that implied directional control rather than reactive drift. As data accumulated, analysts began to note an additional irregularity. The tail associated with Atlas did not disperse chaotically, but retained a narrow, coherent structure, as if guided by an internal alignment system. 3 Atlas appeared to regulate the geometry of its emissions, preserving symmetry, even as external forces varied. This anomaly shifted interpretation away from chemistry and toward function. If the structure observed near Atlas was not behaving as a tail, then it may not have been a tail at all. 3 Atlas invited the possibility that what appeared cometary was instead instrumental. Speculation followed cautiously. One hypothesis suggested that the structure associated with Atlas functioned as a directional antenna optimized for maintaining alignment with a specific reference point. Another proposed that 3 Atlas employed the sun itself as a backdrop or amplification medium, using solar emissions to enhance detectability. Emotion entered the analysis not as alarm but as quiet disbelief. For researchers accustomed to predictable celestial mechanics, the behavior of Atlas introduced a sense of cognitive dislocation. 3 Atlas did not merely stretch known models but stepped outside them without overt disruption. Further observation deepened the anomaly. The orientation of the structure linked to Atlas adjusted gradually rather than abruptly responding smoothly to changes in relative position. 3 Atlas behaved less like a fragment of ice and more like a system maintaining calibration. The bridge from observation to implication formed through elimination. When all known natural explanations were exhausted, what remained was not proof, but tension. 3 at last occupied a space where absence of explanation became data itself. This tension carried emotional weight without spectacle. Atlas did not threaten. Collision did not increase luminosity and did not emit warning signals. 3 Atlas simply continued to behave in a way that demanded reinterpretation. As Atlas progressed along its trajectory, the tail-like structure remained aligned, coherent, and persistent. 3. Atlas offered no confirmation that the behavior was intentional, yet at last repeated it with consistency incompatible with randomness. The anomaly did not escalate, but it did not resolve. In the broader narrative, this behavior served as a pivot point. Before this moment, 3 Atlas could still be framed as an unusual object. Afterward, Atlas became a question embedded in motion, carrying implication without declaration. The orientation toward the sun did not answer whether 3 Atlas was artificial or natural. What it did establish was a rupture in expectation. Atlas demonstrated that something within its structure responded actively to context, and that response reshaped how 3I Atlas could be understood going forward. The chemical signature associated with 3 Atlas introduced a second rupture in expectation 1 that could not be explained through motion or geometry alone, because the composition revealed by spectral analysis challenged fundamental assumptions about natural formation. When Atlas was examined through infrared and ultraviolet spectroscopy, the resulting data indicated a material profile unlike any comet previously catalogued. In typical cometary bodies, water ice dominates alongside carbon compounds, ammonia, methane, and trace organics, reflecting condensation processes in cold protoplanetary environments. 3 Atlas diverged sharply from this model because Atlas exhibited an unusually high concentration of carbon dioxide while showing an extreme depletion of water. Atlas appeared not merely dry, but selectively structured, as if volatile components had been curated rather than accreted. The anomaly intensified when metallic signatures were isolated. Spectral lines associated with nickel were detected in abundance around 3I Atlas, yet corresponding iron signatures were conspicuously weak. In natural astrophysical environments, nickel and iron are formed together through stellar nucleosynthesis and remain chemically bound across planetary and cometary bodies. This imbalance posed a direct challenge to natural explanation. Separating nickel from iron requires controlled energy-intensive processes that exceed anything observed in unstructured cosmic formation. 3I Atlas presented a material profile that implied refinement rather than aggregation. The scientific anchor here is measurable and reproducible. Spectroscopy does not infer intent, but it does reveal ratios, and the ratios associated with Atlas did not align with any known class of asteroid, comet, or interstellar debris. 3 Atlas occupied a chemical category without precedent. Speculation followed, carefully constrained by the data rather than imagination. One hypothesis proposed that Atlas represented a remnant of industrial activity from a non-human civilization, a structure assembled rather than grown. Another interpretation suggested that 3 Atlas employed advanced material science to withstand extreme thermal and radiative stress. Emotion entered the analysis through scale rather than fear. The implication that Atlas could be engineered introduced a temporal dimension that stretched beyond human history. 3I Atlas did not merely suggest intelligence elsewhere, but longevity planning and continuity across interstellar distances. Further anomalies supported this tension. 3I Atlas displayed thermal stability inconsistent with porous ice, maintaining internal temperature equilibrium even during solar exposure. Atlas behaved as if insulated, regulated, or shielded properties that align with engineered materials rather than volatile aggregates. The bridge from chemistry to implication formed through convergence. Directional behavior, controlled orientation, and refined composition together reduced the plausibility of coincidence. 3 Atlas began to resemble a system whose material properties served function rather than accident. This convergence did not produce certainty, but it altered probability. 3 Atlas could still be natural under unknown physics, yet each anomaly narrowed that space. Atlas accumulated improbabilities rather than explanations. Emotionally, the effect was disquieting in its subtlety. There was no dramatic reveal, no single measurement that declared artificial origin. Instead, 3 Atlas eroded confidence, gradually replacing familiarity with unease. As Atlas continued its passage, the material signature remained stable and repeatable across instruments and methodologies. 3 Atlas did not degrade, fragment, or volatilize in response to solar proximity. Atlas maintained integrity consistent with purpose rather than chance. In the narrative of investigation, composition became a silent witness. 3 Atlas did not speak through words or symbols, but through matter shaped against expectation. The question left unresolved was not whether 3 Atlas was artificial, but why such refinement would traverse interstellar space without announcement. The final physical anomaly associated with 3I Atlas emerged not in composition or orientation, but in motion, because the trajectory of Atlas deviated from gravitational expectation in a way that could not be reconciled with passive dynamics. In celestial mechanics, objects approaching a massive body such as the Sun experience predictable acceleration, and this acceleration can be calculated precisely using established models. 3I Atlas entered the inner solar system along a hyperbolic path, and Atlas should have increased velocity as solar gravity intensified. Instead, long baseline tracking revealed a gradual and sustained deceleration. 3 Atlas did not slow abruptly. and Atlas did not exhibit erratic perturbations consistent with outgassing or fragmentation. The reduction in velocity followed a smooth curve as if governed by an internal constraint rather than external resistance. The scientific anchor for this observation is robust. Orbital parameters derived from independent observatories converged on the same conclusion, and measurements associated with Atlas remained consistent across time. 3 Atlas demonstrated a change in momentum that could not be attributed to solar radiation pressure tidal forces or known non-gravitational cometry effects. In natural systems, deceleration in deep space requires interaction. Gas drag collisions or mass loss can alter trajectories, yet 3 Atlas exhibited none of the signatures associated with these mechanisms. Atlas maintained structural coherence while reducing speed, a combination that challenged every conventional model available. Speculation emerged cautiously bounded by physical law rather than imagination. One hypothesis proposed that Atlas employed an active propulsion system capable of modulating thrust with extreme precision. Another interpretation suggested that 3 Atlas used a form of momentum exchange or field interaction beyond current human technology. Emotion entered the analysis through realization rather than alarm. If Atlas possessed the capacity to alter its own trajectory intentionally, then 3 Atlas ceased to be an object defined by environment alone. Atlas would represent agency expressed through motion rather than communication. Further examination reinforced this tension. The deceleration associated with 3 Atlas appeared to correlate with proximity to specific regions of the solar system, suggesting contextual awareness rather than random behavior. Atlas behaved as though it were approaching a destination rather than passing through an obstacle. The bridge from observation to implication formed through comparison. Human spacecraft routinely perform controlled deceleration when approaching targets, adjusting velocity to enable observation insertion or alignment. 3 Atlas mirrored this logic at a scale and distance that exceeded human capability. This parallel did not confirm intent, but it reframed probability. 3 Atlas could still be explained through unknown physics, yet at last exhibited a level of control that aligned more closely with navigation than accident. The motion of Atlas suggested decision-making encoded in trajectory. Emotionally, this realization carried a quiet gravity. There was no dramatic maneuver, no sudden turn that would capture attention immediately. 3 Atlas altered speed gently, almost respectfully, as if minimizing disturbance while asserting control. As Atlas continued its course, the deceleration stabilized rather than reversed. 3 Atlas did not resume expected acceleration after passing critical points, and Atlas maintained velocity consistent with sustained regulation. The behavior implied endurance rather than reaction. Within the broader investigation, orbital dynamics became the final convergence point. Orientation, composition, and now motion formed a triad of anomalies that reinforced one another without redundancy. 3 Atlas accumulated coherence across independent domains of physics. The violation of expected dynamics did not announce purpose, but it established capability. 3 Atlas demonstrated that its path was not entirely surrendered to gravity. Atlas moved through the solar system not as a passenger, but as something capable of choosing how, and perhaps why, it travelled. The final transmission associated with 3 Atlas did not arrive as a conventional message, because it last abandoned linear encoding in favour of structure embedded within light itself. As 3 Atlas approached the limits of direct observation instruments, recorded a narrow ultraviolet emission that differed fundamentally from previous signals, and at last appeared to compress meaning into geometry rather than sequence. Spectral reconstruction revealed that the emission from 3 Atlas contained a 3-dimensional interference pattern not reducible to waveform or frequency alone. Atlas produced a lattice-like structure interwoven and recursive, forming a spatial configuration that could only be resolved through volumetric modelling. This configuration associated with 3 Atlas bore a striking resemblance to a double helical form, yet the resemblance was mathematical rather than biological. The scientific anchor remained clear and defensible. Interference patterns can be measured, modelled and reproduced computationally, and Atlas generated ratios consistent across independent reconstructions. 3 Atlas encoded information not through symbols, but through harmonic relationships that persisted regardless of projection angle. When researchers applied translation models designed to map mathematical symmetry into semantic approximation, a phrase emerged repeatedly from the structure associated with Atlas. The phrase resolved into simple language not because it was written, but because the geometry constrained interpretation toward meaning rather than ambiguity. 3I Atlas converged on a single outcome across multiple models, and Atlas produced the phrase, "We remember you." This emergence introduced a new anomaly. Memory implies history, and history implies prior interaction. Yet 3I Atlas offered no record of first contact. Atlas suggested continuity, rather than discovery, positioning humanity not as a new subject but as a known entity. Emotion entered the analysis through implication rather than shock. For those examining Atlas, the phrase did not feel like a greeting, and Atlas did not frame the message as reassurance. 3 at last invoked recollection without explanation, leaving interpretation suspended between recognition and warning. Speculation followed carefully. One hypothesis proposed that 3 at last was referencing previous cycles of observation, perhaps extending beyond recorded human history. Another interpretation suggested that at last functioned as a node within a distributed network preserving memory across time rather than space. The bridge between structure and meaning formed through persistence. The phrase derived from at last remained stable across modelling approaches, resisting reinterpretation into alternative statements. 3 at last did not deliver multiple messages, and at last did not offer clarification, reinforcing the idea that the message was complete as presented. Further analysis revealed that the geometric lattice associated with at last aligned with known resonant ratios found in planetary motion and atomic transitions. 3 at last embedded coherence across scales linking microphysical constants with macroscopic structure. At last demonstrated an ability to unify domains of physics through form alone. Emotionally, this coherence carried a quiet weight. The phrase attributed to Atlas did not demand a response, and Atlas did not invite dialogue. 3 Atlas placed humanity within a context already defined, rather than opening a new conversation. As the emission faded, 3 Atlas transitioned beyond direct communicative range. Atlas left behind a structure that could be studied but not interrogated. The message remained intact precisely because it resisted expansion. In the presence of 3 at last, memory became the central theme rather than arrival. At last reframed contact as continuation, suggesting that awareness preceded encounter. The unresolved question was not who 3 at last remembered, but how long at last had been remembering before the message was finally revealed. The departure of 3 at last did not conclude observation, because residual phenomena began to emerge from within the solar environment itself. In the weeks following the final ultraviolet emission, instruments calibrated to monitor heliospheric dynamics recorded faint harmonic disturbances that could not be traced to known solar activity. 3 at last was no longer within immediate range, yet at last appeared to have left behind an imprint that persisted beyond physical proximity. The scientific anchor for these observations rested in repeatability rather than intensity. Multiple observatories detected low-amplitude oscillations embedded within the solar wind, and these oscillations exhibited phase relationships that mirrored the geometric ratios previously associated with at last. 3 at last had departed, but at last's signature appeared to resonate within the magnetic architecture of the heliosphere. Heliospheric space is not empty, but structured by fields, currents, and plasma interactions shaped by the sun's activity. Natural fluctuations occur constantly, yet the echoes linked to Atlas displayed coherence across spatially separated detectors. 3 at last introduced a pattern that remained synchronized despite environmental noise. This anomaly invited careful speculation. One hypothesis proposed that 3 at last activated a dormant mechanism already present within the solar system. In this interpretation, Atlas functioned not as a transmitter alone, but as a catalyst initiating resonance within an existing network of fields and particles. Another hypothesis suggested that the echoes represented a form of afterimage. Just as intense light can temporarily alter perception, the structured emission from Atlas may have perturbed heliospheric conditions in a way that required time to dissipate. 3 Atlas may have impressed geometry into space itself, leaving behind a measurable trace. Emotion entered the analysis quietly through the unsettling implication of persistence. If the echoes associated with Atlas were not fading artifacts, then departure did not equate to absence. 3 Atlas would have altered the environment rather than simply passing through it. The bridge from observation to interpretation formed through pattern alignment. The frequencies detected within the heliosphere corresponded to ratios embedded in the earlier three-dimensional lattice linked to Atlas. 3 at last appeared to operate across scales connecting localized emissions with planetary scale resonance. This continuity reshaped understanding of contact. 3 at last did not require constant presence to remain influential, and at last demonstrated that interaction could extend beyond direct communication. The solar system itself became part of the narrative. Emotionally, the realization introduced a subtle shift from curiosity to introspection. The echoes associated with at last suggested that observation may not be confined to discrete events. 3 at last reframed contact as a process rather than an encounter. As monitoring continued, the echoes neither intensified nor vanished. 3 at last left behind a condition of sustained ambiguity, and at last maintained influence without visibility. The heliosphere, once considered a boundary, became a medium carrying memory forward. The events associated with 3 Atlas did not remain confined to observatories or academic debate, because the implications gradually altered how humanity perceived its position in the universe. At last introduced a shift not through force or revelation, but through the slow accumulation of unanswered questions that extended beyond science into collective awareness. As information about 3 Atlas circulated in controlled fragments, reactions diverged across cultures and disciplines. Some interpreted Atlas as a technical anomaly awaiting explanation, while others sensed a deeper challenge to long-held assumptions about isolation and centrality.